For more than 2,000 years, the lords of Kush ruled one of the largest kingdoms in the ancient world. They kept their kingdom free and made it rich by trading with Egypt. Then they disappeared, and their story was forgotten along with them. Almost 4,000 years ago, an Egyptian king named Senwosret III fought a war against enemies of Egypt. They lived in a land called Nubia, which is now the present-day nation of Sudan. After he won the war, Senwosret put up a monument that still exists near one part of the Nile River called the Second Cataract. It is in south-central Egypt, where rocks and rapid waters block the Nile. The monument tells how Senwosret fought a kingdom called Kush, and how soldiers could fight Kush in the future. Senwosret told his soldiers that the people of Kush were cowards. If his soldiers acted bravely, the people of Kush would run away. The Kushites fought only when they saw that their enemies were weak and afraid. Senwosret said he knew this was true because he had fought the kingdom of Kush and defeated it. He said that he captured its women and children, took its cattle, and destroyed its crops. He said that future soldiers and kings should be brave and fight to keep the land he had won. Senwosret's words were proud, but were they true? Egyptian kings often bragged about how great their victories were. The people of Kush did not yet know how to write, so they did not have history books that would tell what they thought about Senwosret and the war he fought against them. Archaeologists helped find the answer to this question. Archaeologists are scientists who try to find the truth about things that happened thousands of years ago. Like detectives, they use clues to solve mysteries about the past. Many archaeologists have studied Kush. They have found evidence that Senwosret was bragging. Kush was actually a strong enemy, and the Egyptians were afraid of Kush's warriors. The evidence the archaeologists found is in the ruins of 12 giant fortresses that Senwosret and other Egyptian kings built near the border of Kush. They were the largest fortresses the Egyptians ever built. They had such names as Defeater of the Nehesi, which was another name for the people of Kush. These fortresses no longer stand, but they prove that the Egyptian kings were afraid of Kush and tried to stop its armies from attacking Egypt. Archaeologists have also found out that the Egyptians were so afraid of Kush that they even tried to use magic to defend Egypt. Egyptian priests made little clay dolls and wrote the names of the kings of Kush on them. They baked the dolls so that the clay became hard, and then they broke them. The Egyptians believed that when the dolls broke, the lords of Kush would be hurt. Then the Egyptian armies would win wars they fought against Kush. This evidence proves that ancient Kush was a strong kingdom. But where was it? Kush is the name the Egyptians gave to a kingdom located south of Egypt in Nubia. Like Egypt, Nubia is a long, narrow desert region. Large numbers of people can live only where the Nile River runs through Nubia. The people of ancient Nubia were dark-skinned people with curly hair, just like the people who live there today. Most of them were farmers. They raised wheat and other crops on land watered by the Nile. A few ancient Nubians lived in the desert and earned their living by raising sheep, goats, and cattle. There were some Nubians who earned their living by trading with Egypt. Egyptians wanted many things that they could find only in Nubia or further south in Africa. These products included copper, ivory from elephant tusks, gold, hard stone for statues, a black wood called ebony, and strange plants and animals such as baboons. Traders also brought slaves to Egypt. Egyptians needed all these things from Kush so they could build monuments and have ceremonies in honor of their gods and their king, who was called a pharaoh. For almost 1,000 years, Egyptians tried to conquer Nubia and get these products without paying for them. By about 2000 BC, they knew they had failed. For almost 500 years, from about 2000 BC to 1500 BC, the Egyptians gave up trying to conquer Kush. Instead, they bought the African products they wanted from the lords of Kush. This made Kush and its rulers rich and powerful. No one knows the names of the first lords of Kush. However, archaeologists found the ruins of their capital city. They have learned much about the lords of Kush and how they lived. Just where the first lords of Kush lived and ruled their kingdom was one of the great mysteries of Egyptian history. Ancient Kush no longer exists, and its people left few records. Egyptians wrote about fighting wars with Kush. However, they said only that Kush was located somewhere south of Egypt. They did not mark its capital city on a map. Two archaeologists found the answer to this mystery. One was an American named George Reisner. Reisner led the first excavation of Kerma, a village near the Nile River, in 1906. The other archaeologist is a man from Switzerland named Charles Bonnet. Decades after Reisner, Bonnet began to lead yearly excavations of Kerma that continue to this day. Both of these men found things that told about how the people of Kush lived and died. They found the ruins of the capital city of the first lords of Kush. There are only a few places in Nubia where people can build cities. Because it does not rain in much of Nubia, people can live and farm only where the Nile floods and brings water for their crops. An ancient city needed lots of farmland to feed the people who lived there. One such place was just south of the third cataract of the Nile, near a village called Kerma. It was there that George Reisner and Charles Bonnet found the capital city of ancient Kush and the tombs of the first lords of Kush. Their discoveries help us imagine what a visit to the capital city of the lords of Kush would be like. People who visited by boat could see that the city was divided into two parts. Most of the people lived near the Nile in small rectangular mud houses with rooms built around courtyards. There were large ovens, jars to store water and food, and yards for animals. Above the low houses of the poor people, visitors could see the palace of the king and the high mud brick walls and gates that protected the temples of the gods. The biggest temple was a rectangular building with a huge gate more than 60 feet high. On the roof of the temple, priests prayed to the gods of Kush. Near the temple were the houses of priests and government officials, as well as the royal palace. The palace was a large rectangular building with many rooms. In the middle of the palace was a large round hall with a high ceiling where the king of Kush greeted visitors from other lands. The walls of the palace were covered with bright paintings of boats and herds of wild animals. There was also beautiful furniture, such as beds made of ebony. They were decorated with beautiful red pottery and pieces of ivory shaped like African animals. Clothing was simple but colorful. Men wore decorated caps and loincloths. A loincloth is a small piece of cloth like a bathing suit. They were made of goatskin and had a beaded belt. Sometimes a man hung a short copper sword in a leather holder from the belt. Women wore short leather skirts. They used beaded hair ornaments and carried fans and bronze mirrors. The fans were made of ostrich feathers to protect them from the heat and flies. Both men and women wore all kinds of jewelry made from gold, silver, stones such as quartz, and even pieces of ostrich eggshells and giraffe hair. At the edge of the desert, east of the city, was the cemetery where thousands of people were buried. By studying their tombs, archaeologists have learned that the people of Kush believed that after death there was life in another world. Just like the Egyptians, they thought that people lived in the world of the dead the same way they did in the present world. This explains why they built a city for the dead. People's tombs in the city of the dead were their homes. The tombs had food for the dead to eat and clothes for the dead to wear, just as they had when they lived on earth. Just as the royal palace was the largest house in the capital, the biggest tombs in the cemetery were those of the lords of Kush. The people of early Kush did not build pyramids for their rulers like the Egyptians did. Instead, they built huge round mounds of earth. Some of these mounds were more than 40 feet high and more than 300 feet across. That is bigger than a football field. When a king died, his body was laid on a bed along with his weapons and treasures in a special room in the center of the tomb. Since the king would need help to rule in the land of the dead, just as he did when he was alive, hundreds of people were buried alive in his tomb with him. This was done so they could serve him after death. These people included his wives, servants, and even his soldiers. On the day of the funeral, the people who were going to be buried with the king, dressed in their best clothes, went into the tomb and lay down quietly. Then they let the tomb builders cover them with dirt. They died because they could not breathe. Food was put into the tomb for them to eat in the next world. Sheep were also killed and buried in the tomb, so the people who were buried would be able to get food and wool in the next world. Even dogs were buried, so that the dead people could play with their favorite pets. These people must have believed it was a great honor to die with their king. The royal tombs stayed sealed until archaeologists discovered their secrets about 100 years ago. The lords of Kush became almost as strong as the kings of Egypt. They even took over the great fortresses that Senwosret and his people had built. War between Egypt and Kush began again when an Egyptian king named Kamos caught a spy taking a letter to the king of Kush. It was a letter from one of Egypt's enemies. It asked the king of Kush to join him in attacking Egypt. The war lasted a long time. It ended about 1500 BC, when another Egyptian king named Thutmose I defeated Kush and burned its capital to the ground. One of his soldiers tells in his letters how Thutmose I killed the last lord of Kush and brought his body back to Egypt. The body was hung upside down from the mast of his ship like a flag in order to frighten the people of Kush. For more than 500 years, there were no lords of Kush. Instead, the country of Kush was ruled by a person who was given the job by the king of Egypt. The Egyptians called him the king's son of Kush. The Egyptians took the wealth of Kush. They also built towns and temples that were like those in Egypt. They taught the people of Kush to worship Egyptian gods. The most important of these gods was Amun, the god of the sky and the king of the gods. Amun was the father and protector of the Egyptian king. The Egyptians also believed that Amun had two homes. One was in the city of Thebes in Egypt. The other was at a place in Kush called Napata. Napata was hundreds of miles south of Kerma. Just as the Egyptians built a great temple for Amun in Thebes, they also built a great temple for him at Napata. It became the most important temple in Kush. As long as Egypt was strong, it ruled Kush. By 900 BC, Egypt had become weak. Instead of being ruled by one king who governed the whole country, Egypt was ruled by many kings who fought with each other. Soon there were no more kings' sons of Kush. New lords of Kush appeared, and Kush was free again. Unlike the first lords of Kush, their capital city was not in Kerma. It was the city the Egyptians built in Napata. Napata was thought of as a holy city. Like the Egyptians, the people of Kush believed that the god Amun lived in Napata. They believed that Amun's home was in the sacred mountain of Gebel Berkel in the center of the city. Just like the Egyptians, the people of Kush believed that Amun really lived inside the mountain. The people of Kush worshipped him in the old Egyptian temple in front of the mountain. The people of Kush thought that Amun was their king's holy father. They believed that Amun chose their kings even before they were born. When a king was crowned, he was brought to Amun for the god's approval. No one knows exactly what kind of ceremony took place. Experts think that priests carried a small statue of Amun in a model boat. If Amun approved of the king, the priests moved the boat in a special way when it passed the new king. Then the people believed that Amun had given his approval of the new king. The new lords of Kush believed that Amun had given them power over both Kush and Egypt. One of them, Kashta even went to Egypt and made his daughter high priestess of Amun at Thebes. The Egyptians thought Kashta's daughter was Amun's wife and queen. About 753 BC, Kashta's son, Pi, became the king. Almost 20 years later, Pi learned that there was trouble in Egypt. One Egyptian king, Tefnachta, was threatening Thebes. Tefnachta ruled a city called Sais in northern Egypt, but he wanted to become the king of all Egypt. Pi learned that Tefnachta had teamed up with other kings, and together they were trying to take over all of Egypt. When Pi learned about these plans, he decided to fight Tefnachta in order to protect his sister and the priests of Amun at Thebes. On a great monument he put up in the temple of Amun at Napata, Pi told the story of the war he fought in Egypt. Archaeologists found the monument and brought it to a museum in the city of Cairo, Egypt, where people can still see it. Pi wrote a report of his war in Egypt in Egyptian writing called hieroglyphics. It can still be read today. It is an exciting story. Pi wrote on his monument how he laughed when he first heard about Tefnachta's plans. He was sure his soldiers in Egypt would defeat Tefnachta. Pi said that he told his soldiers to fight bravely to protect Thebes so that Amun and his priests would be safe. He wanted them to beat Tefnachta, but only in a fair fight. Pi did not want his soldiers to cheat or make a sneak attack on Tefnachta. His soldiers did what Pi said. They fought bravely and beat Tefnachta, but they did not catch him. Pi wrote that he was very angry when he learned that Tefnachta had escaped. His sister and the priests of Amun would never be safe if Tefnachta was free. Pi decided to go to Egypt to fight Tefnachta himself after the beginning of the new year. He brought a great army and a fleet of boats to Thebes. On New Year's Day, he prayed to Amun for victory. Then Pi began the war against Tefnachta and the other kings who were his friends. Pi wrote that he decided to attack the cities of each of the kings who were Tefnachta's friends. If he beat them, then Tefnachta would become weak because he would have no friends to help him fight Pi. Pi wrote that he did the same thing to each city. His army and fleet surrounded the city so the people could not escape. Then he told the king to give up, or the people in his city would become hungry and die. Pi's plan worked. When he reached each city, the king of that city gave up without a fight. The kings gave Pi many gifts of gold and jewels. They begged Pi to forgive them. One king, Un, was so afraid of Pi that he even sent his own wife and daughter to ask Pi's family for mercy. Pi was generous. He was sorry about the suffering of the people, although he was very angry that Un had not taken care of his horses. Still, he forgave Un. Soon, Pi had taken over most of Egypt. Only a few kings stayed friends with Tefnachta. One of them was the king of the city of Memphis in Egypt. Pi brought his army and fleet to Memphis, a large city near Cairo. Memphis was surrounded by the Nile River, and it had strong walls. The king of Memphis thought he was safe because Tefnachta had sent him help. He was wrong. Pi's soldiers wanted to wait until the people of Memphis became too hungry to fight. Pi had a different idea. He told his soldiers to attack right away. He had his ships bring his soldiers right up to the walls of Memphis. Some of the soldiers climbed over the walls and into the city. Others broke down the gates. Many people died in the fighting until the king of Memphis gave up. Tefnachta had not been able to help him after all. Tefnachta's last friends gave up after Pi captured Memphis. Tefnachta was alone and afraid. He sent a messenger to ask Pi to forgive him. He promised that he would do anything Pi asked. As a result, Pi forgave Tefnachta and let him and the other kings keep their cities. The war was over. Pi became the king of all Egypt instead of Tefnachta. His kingdom was huge. It was more than 1,000 miles from the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the city of Napata in the south. That is almost as big as the state of California. Pa kingdom was one of the largest in the ancient world. Pa went back to Kush, rich and powerful. He brought treasures from the Egyptian kings that he beat. Pa wanted to change the way the people of Kush lived. He wanted them to worship many Egyptian gods and write with hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are pictures that Egyptians used to write their language. Pa also wanted to build monuments and put up statues like those he had seen in Egypt. To do these things, Pa brought back with him many Egyptian priests, craftsmen, and artists. The priests taught the people of Kush to worship many Egyptian gods. Some of these gods were Osiris, king of the dead, Isis, the mother of the king, Horus, their son, Anubis, the protector of the dead, and Hathor, the goddess of beauty and love. The most important god of all was still Amun. Since Pa thought that Amun helped him win the war, he fixed up Amun's temple at Napata and made it larger. Craftsmen and artists covered it with pictures and sculptures that told the story of the war in Egypt. Amun's temple was the biggest and most beautiful temple in Kush. Pa also wanted a pyramid for his tomb, like the ones Egyptians built for their kings more than 1,000 years earlier. When Pa died, the people of Kush built a pyramid for him near Napata. This pyramid did not look like the ones in Egypt. It was smaller than an Egyptian pyramid and had much steeper sides. Also, Pa was not buried in the pyramid, but in a special room under the pyramid. Like the first lords of Kush, Pa believed that he would live again in the next world. He had the priests make his dead body into a mummy, like the Egyptian kings did. He would also need horses to pull his chariot in the next world, so they killed Pa's favorite horses and buried them with him. They also thought Pa would need a lot of workers and other people to help him. They did not kill these people, as the first lords of Kush had done. The Egyptian priests taught Pa that people did not have to die with him to help him in the next world. Pa could have magical workers. These magical workers are called shabtis. They are little dolls with hieroglyphs on them. The hieroglyphs say that the shabtis will work for Pa in the next world when the gods call them. Archaeologists found 60 shabtis in Pa's tomb. Pa clearly needed a lot of workers in the next life. Every lord of Kush after Pa wanted a pyramid. Archaeologists have found more pyramids in Kush than in all of Egypt. Pa was a great king, but he made a mistake. He trusted Tefnachta to keep his word when he promised to obey Pa. That was a big mistake. Even before Pa died, Tefnachta and his son broke their word and tried to take over Egypt again. It took almost 10 years to beat Tefnachta and his son. The lords of Kush learned from Pa's mistake. They knew they could not trust Egyptian rulers like Tefnachta. To control Egypt, they would have to live in Egypt and be the kings of both Egypt and Kush. That is exactly what they did. They moved from Napata to the city of Memphis in northern Egypt. The lords of Kush lived in Egypt for almost 50 years. Teharka was the most famous lord of Kush to live in Egypt. Teharka was Pa's son. In 690 BC, he became the king of Egypt and Kush. Teharka was born in Napata, but he lived in Memphis. He was a general before he became the king. His sister was the high priestess and wife of the god Amun, just like their aunt before her. Although he lived in Memphis for most of his life, Teharka did not forget his home or family in Napata. He even brought his mother to Memphis to see him crowned king. The mother of a lord of Kush was very important. A man could become a lord of Kush only if his mother was the sister of a king of Kush. Teharka's mother's name was Abba. She was so happy when she saw Teharka sitting on the throne in Memphis as king of Egypt and Kush that she had her feelings written on a monument. While Teharka was the king, both Kush and Egypt did very well. The Nile flooded just right. It brought water for crops and killed the rodents and insects that would have eaten the crops. Winds were cool, so crops did not dry out. There was a lot of food, and life was good for the people of Egypt and Kush. Taharka believed that Amun and the other gods made these good things happen. Taharka tried to reward the gods for helping him. He repaired many old temples and built new ones in Kush and Egypt. He also put up many statues in these temples, including a beautiful sphinx that can still be seen today. A sphinx is an imaginary animal with the body of a lion and the head of a man. The people of Kush and Egypt believed sphinxes protected their kings and gods. This sphinx has the head of Taharka, so we know what he looked like. Although Taharka was a great king, his life ended badly. Taharka's trouble did not start in Egypt. It started northeast of Egypt in Palestine. The Jews and other people of Palestine were in danger from the country Assyria. Assyria is in the northern part of the present-day country of Iraq. The Assyrians were trying to build an empire by taking over nearby countries. They invaded and occupied the southern part of the country of Iraq. Then they began trying to add the people of Palestine to their empire. The Jews and their neighbors needed help. They had heard that the lords of Kush were strong, so they asked Taharka for help. The story of what happened is in the Bible. Taharka had worked hard to make his army strong. Writing found on a monument tells how he made his soldiers do exercises. It says that he even ran races with his soldiers and won. Taharka's army was strong, but it was not strong enough to save the Jews and the other people of Palestine. The Assyrians warned the Jews not to ask Kush for help. They said that Kush could not beat the Assyrian army. They told the Jews that trusting Kush was like trying to lean on a broken stick. They were right. The Assyrians attacked Egypt and beat Taharka twice. The first time they captured his capital city of Memphis. They even captured his wife and children and took them back to Assyria as slaves. The second time they attacked Egypt, the Assyrians captured Thebes. They burned the city and stole all the gold from Amun's temple. Taharka could not save Egypt or his family from the Assyrians. He could only save himself and escape to Kush. There is writing on a monument that tells how Taharka prayed to Amun to help him again, just as Amun did when he made the Nile flood. Sadly, Amun did not help him. Taharka had to spend the rest of his life in Kush. He never returned to Egypt. When he died, the people of Kush buried him in a pyramid at Napata. Although he lost Egypt, the people of Kush thought Taharka was a great king. They even built him the biggest pyramid in Kush. It was more than 160 feet high. They also gave Taharka more than 1,000 magical workers in his tomb. That is more than any other lord of Kush. There were many more lords of Kush after Taharka. They all called themselves King of Egypt and Kush. None of them actually ruled both Egypt and Kush like Taharka did. They ruled only Kush. They also lived in a new capital city called Meroe. It became one of the most famous cities in the ancient world. People read stories about Meroe in books written by the Greeks and Romans. For a long time, no one knew where the city was. The Greeks and Romans told many strange stories about Meroe. They said that the people of Meroe were the tallest, best-looking people in the world. They thought that the people of Meroe lived to be 120 years old and were great warriors. In Meroe, gold was said to be common and cheap. Iron was rare and expensive, so people used gold for tools and iron for jewelry. The strangest thing of all was a wonderful lake. It was said that if you bathed in it, the water made you look young again. People made up these strange stories because Meroe was far away and few people visited the city. It was only a little more than 200 years ago that a Scottish explorer named James Bruce found Meroe. Bruce discovered the ruins of the city at a place close to where the Nile River joins another river, the Atbara. in the present-day country of Sudan. Meroe is located a long way south of Napata. After Bruce discovered Meroe, many archaeologists visited the ruins of the city and studied its monuments. They discovered that the strange stories the Greeks and Romans told about Meroe were not true. They learned that Meroe was a city like Kerma and Napata. About 10,000 people lived in Meroe in houses made of brick and thatch. The houses were built along narrow streets. That way they could have shade from the hot summer sun. The most important part of Meroe, however, was the huge temple of the god Amun and the neighborhood where the royal palace and government buildings were located. The royal palace was protected by strong walls, just like the palace of the first lords of Kush at Kerma. Like the first lords of Kush, the kings who lived in Meroe became rich by trading with Egypt. They sent all sorts of valuable African products to Egypt and traded them for products made in Egypt and other countries. They traded gold, ivory, ebony, and slaves. They also traded for the goods made of iron, silver, and bronze. They bought some of the products, such as wine from Greece and metal bowls, lamps, and beautiful jewelry from Syria and Phoenicia. We know what they bought because the lords of Kush and the rich people of Meroe buried some of their treasures in their tombs. That way they could use them, even after death. Most of their treasures were stolen long ago. Luckily, archaeologists found some things that the thieves did not get and put them in museums. Most of the people who lived in Meroe earned their living by farming or raising cattle. Some people were potters and made jars and plates. They decorated them with pictures of African animals and gods. Other people worked in cemeteries or for the king. One of the most important jobs was working with iron. The people of Meroe used iron for all kinds of weapons and tools. Archaeologists have even found the furnaces they used to make iron, as well as huge piles of trash from the furnaces. The iron industry in Meroe was the largest in ancient Africa. Archaeologists also learned that Meroe was a very old city. It was built almost 3,000 years ago. However, it became the capital of Kush only about 60 years after Taharka died. Archaeologists are not sure why Meroe became the capital of Kush. They think it was because an Egyptian army attacked Napata and stole its treasures. They think that the lords of Kush moved their capital city to Meroe to get farther away from Egypt. This would make it harder for the Egyptians to attack them. The lords of Kush did not forget about Napata after Meroe became the capital of Kush. Napata stayed important for almost 300 more years. The lords of Kush continued to be crowned at Napata and were buried in pyramids there. They wrote reports about their wars and hieroglyphs on monuments, just as Pia had done. They also put up these monuments in the temple of Amun, the same temple that Pia had built at Gebel Birkal. After a long while, the lords of Kush began to be jealous of the power and wealth of the priests of Amun at Napata. Finally, a king named Arkamani fought the priests of Amun and won. After Arkamani, all the rest of the lords of Kush were crowned in a new temple of Amun. It was in Meroe, and they were buried in pyramids built in the desert east of the city. They even invented a new alphabet to use to write stories in their own language instead of Egyptian. Archaeologists call their language Meroitic. They have found many monuments written with this new alphabet. Like the Egyptians, the people who lived in Meroe believed in many gods. Although they lived in Meroe, the lords of Kush still worshipped the same Egyptian gods they had worshipped in Napata: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, Hathor, and others. The most important god was still Amun. Many lords of Kush were also named after Amun. They still believed that Amun protected them and their people. They also worshipped some new gods from Kush. The most important new god was the war god Apadimak. They believed that Apadimak was a brave young warrior with the body of a man and the head of a lion. His favorite weapon was the bow and arrow. He helped the lords of Kush beat their enemies. They still believed in life after death, but they had new ideas about it. Unlike the Egyptians, who buried their kings in the western deserts in the land of the dead, the people of Meroe built their pyramids and tombs in the eastern desert. That way, the dead kings could share with the living the bright light and life-giving heat of the rising sun every day. They no longer thought their kings needed to be made into mummies or to have magical workers after death. The pyramids they built for their kings were much smaller than the ones at Napata. They had steeper sides, and archaeologists think they had metal statues of birds on top. A great many things changed when the lords of Kush moved from Napata to Meroe. For almost 600 years, the lords of Kush ruled most of the land from the border of Egypt south, near the city of Khartoum. Khartoum is now the capital city of the present-day country of Sudan. Although they no longer ruled Egypt, the lords of Kush still ruled one of the largest kingdoms of the ancient world. Egyptians, Macedonians, Persians, and Romans all tried to conquer Kush during these years. The lords of Kush fought back bravely and kept their country free. Sometimes they kept it free by beating their enemies. Sometimes they did it by making deals. The lords of Kush made deals with the Persians and Macedonians to protect Kush. The Persians and Macedonians conquered and ruled Egypt, and they wanted to take over Kush as well. The Persians wanted the African products Kush traded with Egypt. The lords of Kush agreed to give them gold, ebony, ivory, and slaves every 2 years. Pictures of people from Kush with these products still exist in Persia, the present-day country of Iran, at a place called Persepolis. They also agreed to send soldiers to help the Persians fight their wars. Soldiers from Kush even fought in the Persian invasion of Greece. The Macedonians wanted to capture elephants so they could train and use them in wars with other kingdoms. The lords of Kush helped the Macedonians capture elephants. They also learned how to train and ride elephants to use them in their own wars. However, Kush's hardest fight was with the Romans. The Romans came from what is now Italy and conquered Egypt a little more than 2,000 years ago. They conquered Egypt shortly before Jesus was born. Roman Emperor Augustus defeated an Egyptian queen named Cleopatra and her friend Mark Antony in the year 30 BC. This added Egypt to the Roman Empire. Augustus also wanted to add Kush to his empire, and for a short time he did. A Roman army invaded Kush and forced the people to pay taxes to Rome. Although the people of Kush paid the taxes, they wanted to be free again. They soon got their freedom back. The lord of Kush who fought the Romans was not a king. She was a queen. Archaeologists think her name was Amanaraeus. The Romans said she had only one eye and was called a Candax, which is what the people of Kush called the mother of a king. Taharka's mother, Abba, was a Candax. Unlike Abba, Amanaraeus did not let her son become king after her husband died. Instead, she decided to rule Kush herself just as if she were the king. She wanted to free her country from Rome. Amanaraeus pretended to be loyal and paid taxes to the Romans until she saw a chance to fight them. It was 6 years after Rome conquered Kush that the chance came. Part of the Roman army was taken away from the southern border of Egypt to fight elsewhere. Amanaraeus attacked the smaller Roman army and forced them to leave Kush. She even captured a city named Syene near the Egyptian border. Today it is called Aswan. Amanaraeus' army captured many Roman prisoners and brought them back to Meroe. Her army even took back with them statues of Emperor Augustus to show the people of Kush. The war went on for 2 years after Amanaraeus captured Syene. The Romans once captured and stole the treasures of Napata and made many of the people of Kush slaves. Those taken into slavery spent the rest of their lives as slaves in Rome and other cities of the Roman Empire. They were the first Africans many Romans had ever seen. Still, the Romans could not capture Amanaraeus or win the war. Peace was finally made 10 years after the Romans first invaded Kush. Emperor Augustus met messengers from Amanarainus and told them that Kush was free. He even returned all the taxes that Amanarainus had paid Rome. She had freed her people. Like the Egyptians, the Romans liked to brag about their victories and to pretend that they never lost a war. So the Romans said that the people of Kush were cowards. The Romans also said that they let Kush go free because it was poor and not worth ruling. Archaeologists discovered that the Romans were not telling the truth. They discovered that Roman soldiers were kept as slaves in Kush. They also discovered that the Romans let the people of Kush keep a statue of the Emperor Augustus as a prize. Archaeologists found the head of that statue at Meroe and put it in the British Museum in London, England. After becoming free again, Kush did very well for almost 300 years. Trade grew with Rome and Egypt. The people of Kush bought wine, fancy furniture, dishes, and even statues. Some of them learned to read and write Greek and Latin, and they visited the Roman Empire. One of them even visited Jerusalem and met some of the followers of Jesus. The story is in the book Acts of the Apostles in the Bible. After being rich for so long, the kingdom of Kush started to get weak. This happened partly because the Romans began to trade with other African kingdoms instead of Kush. The most important kingdom was Aksum, a country to the east of Kush, which is in the present-day country of Ethiopia. Another reason Kush became weak was that people called the Noba and Blemis began to attack it. They had learned to ride camels. That let them attack Kush from the desert before the lords of Kush knew what was happening. As trade with Egypt and Rome became harder, Kush became poorer. The pyramids of the last lords of Kush were much smaller than those of earlier kings. They did not contain the treasures archaeologists found in earlier tombs. More than 1,600 years ago, a king from Aksum named Ezana conquered Kush for the last time. Ezana wrote on a monument how his armies defeated the people of Kush and destroyed their cities. After his victory, there were no more lords of Kush. The kingdom of Kush had come to an end, more than 2,000 years after the Kerma kings had started it. The people of Kush survived, but their lives changed. New kingdoms and religions appeared in the lands the lords of Kush had once ruled. For a long time, most of the people who lived there were Christians. Now they are called Nubians and are Muslim. Most Nubians live in present-day Egypt and Sudan. As the lives of the people of Kush changed, the history of Kush was forgotten. The story of the lords of Kush became a mystery. Even the location of their last capital, Meroe, was forgotten until James Bruce found it again in 1772. Because of the archaeologists' work, we now know the names of many of the lords of Kush. We also know where they lived, what they did, and even what some of them looked like because archaeologists found their statues. Today, we know much about the lords of Kush and their people, but we still don't know everything. Even though archaeologists have solved many of the mysteries about the lords of Kush, some mysteries still remain. The most important mystery is their language. We don't even know the real name of their language. Archaeologists call it Meroitic. They think it was the language spoken by the lords of Kush and their people after they moved their capital city to Meroe. The people of Kush invented an alphabet to write Meroitic. Their alphabet had 23 letters and 2 symbols to mark the end of a word. Like our alphabet, each letter stood for one sound, but their letters were not the same as ours. The Kushites created their alphabet by giving new meanings to some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs the lords of Kush had used to write their stories. In the new alphabet, each hieroglyph stood for one sound in the Meroitic language. There were 2 forms of the Meroitic alphabet. One form used pictures and was used for monuments. The other form was easier and faster to write and was used for writing letters, government documents, and maybe even books. We know what each letter stood for because archaeologists found some small monuments with the same word written in Egyptian hieroglyphs and in the Meroitic alphabet. Unfortunately, we do not know the meanings of the words on these monuments. Someday, archaeologists may figure out the meanings of the words of the Meroitic language. When they do, what the people of Kush wrote, and their whole story, will no longer be such a mystery.